Um, so Kiran, I have invited a special guest to join us for this session, and that special guest is going to pop up perhaps, and if that person does, then we'll say hello to them. But is this all way too mysterious?
I'm really excited. I don't know.
Who could it be? But I want to jump in and start the excitement. So I have here a wonderful slide that I'm sharing. I'm going to stop sharing my screen in just a moment. That is your full bio, which I am going to actually read because I love so much of it. So Kiran Millwood Hargrave was born in Surrey in 1990, and her earliest ambition was to be a cat, closely followed by a cat owner or the first woman on Mars, which is super cool. She has achieved only one of these things, but discovered that being a writer lets you imagine whatever you want. She started writing poetry in her final year at university, producing 3 poetry books and a play before she turned to fiction. Her best-selling debut, The Girl of Ink and Stars, about a mapmaker's daughter who must save her island, won the Waterstones Children's Book Prize 2017 and the British Book Awards Children's Book of the Year. Did that have a different title in the US, or was it?
Yes, originally it was The Cartographer's Daughter, but for the paperback, they switched on to The Girl of Ink and Stars.
The Girl of Ink and Stars is so beautiful. It's such a beautiful title. Her second standalone story, The Island at the End of Everything, another wonderful title, was shortlisted for the Blue Peter Book Award and the Costa Children's Book Award, and longlisted for the CILIP Carnegie Medal. Her third book, The Way Past Winter, was Blackwell's Children's Book of the Year, 2018. Her debut YA title, The Deathless Girls, was shortlisted for the YA Book Prize 2020, and her first book for adults, The Mercies, was subject to a 13-way auction and debuted at #1 on the Times bestseller list and #5 on the Sunday Times bestseller list. Kiran lives in Oxford with her husband, the artist Tom DeFreston, and the fulfillment of one of her earliest ambitions, their cat, Luna. Everybody, please welcome our special guest today, Kiran, who may have to pop out at some point. And if she does, we will be just fine because she may come back, or we might have our special guest here. But I just can't thank you enough, because you truly got this invitation, I think, 2 days ago. And you got it overnight. You were probably in bed asleep when you got this invitation. And your agent, Kirby Kim, is not just a good friend of mine, but he's just an amazing literary agent, and just seems really cool to have the chance to talk to you about a book that I really just love. So would you treat us to, before we jump in and start chatting, will you treat us to a reading? That would be wonderful.
I'm going to read for about 5 minutes.
Okay.
From the opening chapter. Last night, Marin dreamt a whale beached itself on the rocks outside her house. She climbed down the cliff to its heaving body and rested her eye against its eye, wrapped her arms across the great, stinking swell. There was nothing she could do for it but this. The men came scrambling down the black rock like dark, swift insects, glinting and hard-bodied with blades and scythes. They began to swing and cut before the whale was even dead. It bucking and all of them grim and holding like nets tight about a shoal, her arms growing long and strong around it, so wide and fierce she held it, until she didn't know if she was a comfort or a menace and didn't care, only watched its eye with her eye, not blinking. Eventually it stilled, its breath melting out as they hacked and sawed. She smelt the blubber burning in the lamps before it stopped moving, long before the bright roll of its eye beneath her eye wore down to dullness. She sank down into the rocks until she stood at the bottom of the sea. The night above was dark and moonless, stars scarring the surface. She drowned and came up from sleep gasping, smoke in her nostrils and at the dark back of her throat. The taste of burning fat caught under her tongue and would not be washed away. The storm comes in like a finger snap. That's how they'll speak it in the months and years after, when it stops being only an ache behind their eyes and a crushing at the base of their throats, when it finally fits into stories. Even then, it doesn't tell how it actually was. There are ways words fall down. They give shape too easily, carelessly, and there was no grace, no ease to what Marin saw. That afternoon, the best sail is spread like a blanket across her lap, Mama and Dean at its other corners. Their smaller, neater fingers are working smaller, neater stitches into the windwear tears, while she patches cloth over holes left by the mast fastenings. Beside the fire, there's a stack of white heather drying, cut and brought by her brother Eric from the low mountain on the mainland. Tomorrow, after, Mama will give her 3 palmfuls for her pillow. She'll wrench it apart, stuff it earth and all into the casing, the honey scent almost sickening after months of only the stale smell of sleep and unwashed hair. She'll take it between her teeth and scream until her lungs wheeze with the sweet dirt tang of it. Now, something makes her look up and out towards the window. A bird dark against dark, a sound. She stands to stretch, to watch the bay flat grey and beyond it the open sea, tips of waves like smashed glass glittering. The boats are loosely pegged out against it by their 2 small lights, bow and aft, barely flickering. Her arms crackle. She brings one needle-coarsened finger to the other and pushes it under her woolen cuff, feels the hair stiff and the skin beneath it tightening. The boats are still rowing, still steady in the uncertain light, lamps glimmering. And then the sea rises up and the sky swings down and greenish lightning slings itself across everything, flashing the black into an instantaneous, terrible brightness. Mama is fetched to the window by the light and the noise, the sea and the sky clashing like a mountain splitting so they feel it through their souls and spines, sending Marin's teeth into her tongue and hot salt down her gullet. And then maybe both of them are screaming, but there is no sound save the sea and the sky and all the boat lights swallowed and the boats flashing and the boats spinning, the boats flying, turning, gone. Marin goes spilling out into the wind, creased double by her suddenly sodden skirts, Dina calling her in, wrenching the door behind to keep the fire from going out. The rain is a weight on her shoulders, the wind slamming her back, hands tight in on themselves, grasping nothing. She is screaming so loud her throat will be bruised for days. All about her, other mothers, sisters, daughters are throwing themselves at the weather, dark, rain-slick shapes, clumsy as seals. The storm drops before she reaches the harbour, 200 paces from home, its empty mouth gaping as the sea. As she watches, a final flash of lightning illuminates the hatefully still sea, and from its blackness rise oars and rudders and a full mast with gently stowed sails, like underwater forests uprooted. Of their men, there is no sign. It is Christmas Eve.
Oh my gosh. Wow, that is such a powerful opening to this story, and so beautifully also, you know, obviously you have a much more lovely accent than I do, so so beautiful to hear you read it. But how gorgeous. And you know, I had heard so much about this book before I bought it, and that's why I bought it, because there were just so many people talking about this amazing debut adult novel, but certainly not a debut novel. And I was looking around a little bit at some of the reviews that people have had, and I loved this. There was a Goodreads reader who said in all bold at the top of their review, and excuse me, I'm going to curse. I hope that's okay. Fuck this book and what it did to my heart. And then the very last line of the review is a highly worthy read.
I'm honored. I don't go on Goodreads. Like self-reflection.
No author should ever go on Goodreads. It's a terrible idea, but I think that speaks a lot to the sort of emotional depth of this story, and how harrowing it is in so many different ways. And I don't want to give a lot away because I have a feeling, even just based on that reading you just did, that we're going to sell a lot of copies of the Mercies to folks today. But can you talk about, because it is based on a true story, and could you talk a little bit about that? What brought you to this story?
Definitely. So my first encounter with the story was a piece of art that I saw on a BBC article. It was by Louise Bourgeois, who's one of my favorite artists and who deals a lot with the domestic. And this was a very different piece for her. It was a metal chair with this flame coming out of the seat of it. And it was surrounded by these bronze mirrors, and it was all encased in a sort of cage of smoked glass. And I just had to go and see this, and so I thought it must be in one of the cultural capitals of the world. So I was sort of, googling where it was, and it turned out that it was on a tiny Arctic Circle island off the northeasternmost point of Norway, an absolutely remote speck called Vardø. At the time I pronounced it Bardot, of course.
That's how I pronounce it.
It's all good. And I sort of googled more, why is it there? Got to Wikipedia, and it turns out that it forms part of a memorial to 91 men and women who were murdered on that spot on this tiny island in what were Scandinavia's worst witch trials. And I have always been fascinated. I think most people have a sort of morbid fascination and curiosity about witch trials, and I think particularly women sort of think, I probably would have been burned as a witch, me, my love of cats, my mole, my independent thought. So I was already curious that I hadn't heard about it. And then the paragraph above that was about the 1617 storm that had occurred 3 years before the witch trials began and had killed 40 fishermen in an instant. Eyewitnesses said it was as though it was conjured. And when I read that, it really gave me chills, because all my novels have begun with a strong image. That's how I write, is I really latch on to some sort of strong visual. And the idea that this storm happened and then 3 years later these witch trials happened, it felt like a gift. It felt like this is the structure of a novel. And plus I was curious. I think all novels begin with a question. And my question was, what happened? What happened? How did these women survive without the majority of their men on this tiny, bleak, remote, harsh place? How did they survive those 3 years, only to then most of them be burned in these witch trials, 3 years later? And it was just, the novel was a desperate unraveling of a way to answer those questions for me.
And then how much, you have this wonderful opening and you have this idea of where everything is going. And I'm just wondering how much of the research and how much you had to fill in with the actual truth of those events, or did you just take this great inspiration and go with it?
So initially, and this is the way I always work, I like to find the heat of the story, which tends to me to come through character. And even when I'm writing historical fiction, I don't feel the need to do a great amount of research before I start writing, because I feel like there are universal human emotions that drive every person, and they won't have changed that much. I understand what fear feels like. I understand desire. I understand hatred. I understand love. So those drivers very much become the basis for any story I write. And then I'll go back and seed in the research later. Obviously, I did my best guess of how these women lived, what they ate, what they wore. But even when I went back and did that research in earnest, and I contacted an amazing woman called Dr. Liv Helen Williamson, who is just the most extraordinary academic who specializes in these witch trials. And she's actually translated all of the women's testimonies into English. And this wouldn't have happened, this book wouldn't have been able to happen without her, but she's translated every single one into English. And I got in touch with her quite early on in my writing and said, I'm writing this book. I'd love to talk to you about your research. And we struck up a friendship. And when I eventually got out there, I met her a couple of times since, and we had the most extraordinary day together, just where we were just meeting for coffee and spent the whole day just talking and walking around and having the most extraordinary exchange. So if it weren't for her research, this would be a very historically inaccurate book, because I don't tend to let anything get in the way of a good story. I see very much my role as a storyteller first and foremost, and I want my reader to be gripped and care. But obviously that does feel quite thin if you then haven't done your research, and it feels like you're emotionally manipulating for nothing. So it did then become very important to make sure that research was firm and watertight, because these were based on real women, and I didn't want to do a disservice in any way to their memory by appropriating them for dramatic means, especially if those means were entirely fabricated.
Well, and how interesting too to be able to go to that place. I mean, talking about authenticity, and I would imagine that for many of us, if we're writing about historical places and we go to them, they probably don't look very much like what they did in those times. But I can't help but think, and maybe I'm just guessing here, that the very northern tip of Norway could still feel, sort of evoke that moment in time this many years later. So cool to be able to walk on that road. And then also I wonder if any of those families are still around, the families of these women. Well, yeah.
I mean, they certainly are. And they aren't in Vardø anymore, but they are certainly in Norway. But this isn't a hugely explored event, even in Norway. It's not like Salem is in the US or Pendle here is here in the UK. Even in Norway, it's not like on a curriculum, or really even the memorial is sort of tucked out the way. And it's not, when I said at the hotel, oh, I'm here for the memorial, they sort of looked at me like, why? So it's not in the same way such a greatly explored thing. But you're absolutely right about being able to go to the place made all the difference to the novel and feel that true attachment. The first time I went, it was summer, and the sun doesn't set in summer this far north. So it was constant light. The curtains were very thin in the hotel room. I wasn't sleeping. So I would just walk for hours, around the memorial, around this area where these women lost their lives. And one thing that really struck me was the smell of heather was everywhere. And it was so sweet and cloying like honey. And every so often you'd get these mists that would come in off the sea at a moment's notice. And anyone who lives near the coast will have experienced this, but I don't. And so it was very disorientating when these mists would come in. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. And then when I went back in winter, the cold was brutal and the sun doesn't rise at all. Mm-hmm. So suddenly you're in this opposite landscape that is completely transformed by this opposite weather. And that in January, which is when I went, is when the women were ducked to see if they floated and therefore were witches. And they would have had to break the ice. Mm-hmm. And that's when I got really angry. And that's when I truly connected. I was already in love with my characters. I already cared, but that was when they became more than characters, and this book became sort of driven by this sense of injustice and became about something bigger than just this story. It became about the injustice and the cruelty that was done to these women. So it was extraordinary to go there, for sure.
So I do have a question for you about structure, and I'm wondering if you could talk about that, because, and I do want to talk about your kids' writing too, and your poetry a little bit, because it's so interesting that you have written in a lot of different genres. But I'm just curious, when you approached this novel and you knew that you had those two different, the 3-year period in between, the two different, the opening and where it was going, how did you even begin to figure out who your main character was going to be and how you were going to take us through this story?
So this never happens to me. This novel was extraordinary for me in so many ways. It came and hit me in the chest and was like, hey, you got to write this now. So I literally put down all my other projects and I just wrote this. And the first draft was so quick. It was like 6 weeks, and it was a complete team effort between me and my UK agent Helly, who is also with Janklow in the UK, and she was up all night with a newborn, so she would edit overnight what I'd written in the day, and then I'd make those changes in the morning, and then carry on writing. And it was a proper like team effort in that respect, the first draft. And that meant that I made a lot of the decisions very fast and very instinctively. And I think that that has really served the book, that I didn't overthink it and that it did feel very propulsive and natural. So Marin, again, this never happens to me, came to me in a dream. So that first thing that I read about the whale was a dream that I had, where I was watching a woman climb down a cliff to a beached whale. And then these men come and they start to hack it apart before it even dies. And then, and I woke up and I was sort of wrote it down, because I never have cool dreams. I'm always just like naked in front of my old class, or, you know, flying down the stairs. So it stuck out that it was extraordinary. And then when I saw the memorial and realized that this was going to be a story for me, I knew that was the perfect beginning, because it really sets up this sort of juxtaposition between superstition and reality, and prophecy versus practicality, that I really wanted to play with in the book. So I had Marin, and she was there. She was just rooted, and she was very much a product of her place and time. It's one of my bugbears in historical fiction where characters feel out of time. You know, they're like these really staunch feminists, or really self-assured in ways that women just weren't liberated or enabled to feel at those times. So she is very much a product of her time. People have described her like a barnacle. She's sort of a barnacle. She's quite hardy, clinging to life at the edge of the world. And I got about a third of the way through writing her story, her grief in the aftermath of the storm, and I was just starting to feel a bit depressed. And I didn't want to write a book that was just sad and just bleak without hope and light, because that's not how I believe life is ever. So that's when I came up with my other protagonist, who eventually gets her own narrative, and it's a dual narrative. And that is Ursa, and she is the daughter of a ship owner in Bergen, which is way south. It's still in Norway, but it's basically in a line with Scotland, so it's much further south. And she's from a wealthy family who's fallen on hard times, and she is married off to a man, Absalom Cornet, who is being sent to Vardia to basically see what's going on, because this is an island of women, and women who are acting in ungodly ways because they're going fishing to feed themselves, and they're building and they're butchering, and it's just not right. So he's been chosen to go there and sort of bring them to heel, and he marries Ursa and brings her north. And she was like, when she arrived in my head, and you first meet her in the bedroom with her sister, and it's just such a different atmosphere to what's already been happening on the island. And if Marin's a barnacle clinging to a rock, people have said that Ursa is like some sort of exotic, soft, like anemone sort of creature. She's very colorful, very bright, very out of place and time when she arrives in Vardia. And what these two women do for each other is they bring out those qualities in each other. Ursa becomes strong, and we recognize that while she might look soft on the outside, inside she has this core of steel. And Marin starts to soften under Ursa's influence, and they make each other more themselves. They make each other more rounded humans. And it is really their friendship that propels this book through all these events that are happening. Really, it's about these two women finding each other and coming together.
Yeah, and especially Marin, because she is the first of the two of them that you attach to, and you realize that she hasn't yet found her person. She hasn't found that, person who understands her. And it's so lovely to see how all of that, develops. I'm wondering, which I'm wondering a little bit about the juxtaposition of Christianity and then is it Sami? Is that, am I saying? Yeah. So, right. And that's obviously a huge part of the story because it informs, it gets us all the way to sort of what's happening with the witches and the trials. But can you talk a little bit about writing that and looking at this, this moment in time and sort of the beliefs that people had?
Absolutely. It's a really extraordinary moment in the world's history. You know, the 1600s is when most of the witch trials started to kick off, and there was this real struggle for control and real mass hysteria that was popping up all over the world. But for Norway in particular, they were struggling because their king, King Christian, he was a relatively weak ruler. He wasn't really respected, and he'd won some sort of indecisive victories at the borders of his country, but he was really looking for a way to make his mark and to be seen and respected on a global scale. And he was looking very closely at Scotland, which is so close to Norway, and King James was actually married to King James's sister, so there was already this existing link between the two countries. And then King James wrote Demonology, which is his study of how to find, spot, and prove a witch, and became the textbook for witch hunters everywhere. And he was having great success. It's always popular to mount a scare campaign against a particular group of people. It's a brilliant way to sort of galvanize the population and create support. And so King Christian saw this, and Vardø became essentially the perfect place to start testing out this new model of control. And I don't believe it was so cynical that he just was like, oh, this is a new model of control, but essentially that's what it boils down to. I do believe he was motivated because he was Christian, and the area where Vardø is, Finnmark, was hugely populated by the Sami people, also derogatorily known as the Lapps, who were the indigenous population. And before the 1620s, the populations mixed, like quite uneasily, but they did mix. And then in 1617, when the storm happened, a sorcery decree was actually brought in, which is at the beginning of the book. And it's sort of outlawed all the Sami practices of wind weaving, which until then Norwegian sailors would go to Sami sorcerers and say, can you see what the weather's going to do today? Can you ensure me safe passage? That became against the law. And so the first people who were killed under these new sorcery laws in these witch trials were actually men, and they were male Sami sorcerers. And then the rest were the women who eventually came to take the blame for the witch trials, for the storm. So it was a really interesting time where this tension was just being deliberately ratcheted up by a king to try and consolidate his power, essentially.
And it's interesting in the novel too, because so many of the characters, it's not, there's such a gray area for them where they're going to church, but they also are putting, they're going to the Sami for the wind calling. They're putting little, are they puppets that they're putting outside their doors? Do you have one?
I have a puppet. I have a rune stone though. I have a rune stone. My publisher sent me some rune stones when they were wooing me. So
they were wooing you.
These mean like friendship and protection.
A lot of authors get champagne. You get rune stones.
My number. This is absolutely up my street.
So that was, I think one thing that also struck me about the book is there are a lot of, I guess, what we would refer to as secondary characters, even though I think you do such an amazing job of giving many of them their due. But so how do you do that? Let's talk a little about craft. What when you have a book like this where there's so many characters, we have obviously two that are our main focus points, but how do you really make sure that those other characters aren't becoming two-dimensional? And what sort of work did you put into building the rest of the women and men in this novel?
A lot. And I think, drafting is the single most important thing. Drafting and editing are the single most important things to making any novel work. Your first draft is always going to be thin and underdeveloped because you can't possibly get everything right first time. You can't possibly look at all those characters equally. So in my first draft, with the exception of really key players like Kirsten, who is one of Marin's friends, and Mama and Dina, who live very closely with Marin, they really, the rest of the cast really were just cardboard cutouts. They were just props, in various scenes. And then the really fun bit of any novel is once you've pushed through that trauma of the first draft and you've got the words on paper, and then you can go back and actually make it good. That's when the magic really starts to happen, and characters start to reveal themselves to you, where once they were just names, they assume personalities. And very much so in the second draft is where those conflicts come in between sort of Marin and Kirsten, and then the Kirk women, the church women, mm-hmm. who believe, very much that they should essentially starve rather than be ungodly by going in a boat, because even now it's bad luck for a woman to go on a boat. My friend's a submariner in the Navy, and she had all sorts of problems, being on board. There are still superstitions around women and boats. So they were really pushing against convention. And so I had real sympathy for what could be seen as the antagonists, the Kirk women. I had real sympathy for their point of view. And I think that it's really important as a writer to have sympathy with every character, even if you don't agree with them, even if you condemn them. Otherwise, they do become these two-dimensional, basically things for you to batter with your ideals. Mm-hmm. You really have to see it from their point of view. And that was, with no one was it more important than Absalom, who is Ursa's husband, who really was just villainous in the first draft. And I just hated him, and he was just a bad person, a baddie. And that was where a lot of the work went in, was trying to understand him and understand that he was as much a product of his time as anyone. He was as much caught in this very rigid structure and trying to make the best of it, and trying to be a good husband in the best way he knew, and trying to serve God in the only way he knew. And so I think really for anyone who's worried about, having a large cast, it is just all in those edits and giving yourself time to do those. And really, you could literally do an edit where you just do one character's character development through the whole thing. You don't have to, in your second draft, go back and do everyone. You could literally pick one character and do a really quick edit where you just give them a few more lines, a few more details, and then you can go back and do the same for the next character. You don't have to just chuck it all think about it in the first draft. No one's going to see this book until you're ready for them to see it. So that's very much how I approach writing, is first drafts are just to get it down, and then the rest is finesse.
I love that you just said that about doing an edit specific to a character's through line and just not worrying about the rest of it. I'm sure I'm just not getting out in the world enough, but I haven't heard someone really address that specifically. So I appreciate that you just said that. I love it.
I write timelines for each character, and I never do this like normally, but the Mercies needed it. So for example, this is Dina's timeline, who is one of the more minor characters.
And cool. This is like the inside scoop.
These are all the things that happen to her, and by attaching a date to it, I can cross-reference with other characters, and it just means that each character gets their own arc, and no one gets left behind. And of course, a lot of this stuff is off the page. Like, you don't need to know her favorite food. Like, do you know what I mean? but I think it just really helps you to manage a larger cast, because it can feel overwhelming, and this was the largest cast I'd ever written, and it was so important for my readers to care about each of them and to have a strong feeling about each of them, even if that was a negative feeling. I needed people to care. So
I also, what you said about cornet and sort of what I've heard often more in thriller or suspense writing, an author will say you have to remember that your antagonist believes that they are the hero of the story. And so to have him, for you to take the time to have empathy for him and sort of understand where he's coming from is, I think, also just such a great piece of advice to writers. So I want you to only write adult novels forever, because now I'm your biggest fan. But our special guest, who is lurking in the background, not showing his face yet, happens to be named Kirby Kim. And and he, as a very good agent, would like me to make sure everyone knows that your next book is middle grade, and it's out in 2020. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that. Are you at the heart, are you a children's literature writer, or are you a writer and you're writing what the stories need to be told and what genre they need to be told in, and sort of toggling back and forth now between these different genres?
Absolutely the latter. Since the beginning of my career, I knew that I just wanted to write stories, and I just wanted to be able to follow my nose and my instincts and write not whatever I felt like in kind of a bratty way, but really follow my interests and allow myself to develop and not put a label on what I did. And I was really lucky that Kirby and my agent here in the UK, Helly, they encouraged that, because that's, it's hard, I think, for publishers, for agents, when you're building a brand, you don't really want to interrupt that because it takes a lot of work and a lot of time and effort and money, on the publisher's respect. So you don't really want to mess with that. But, I look at writers like Margaret Atwood and Marlon James and Philip Pullman, and the way that they just managed to skip through genres and writing brackets. And that's always the kind of writer I've wanted to be. I've always wanted to push myself, evolve, challenge myself. So I absolutely love writing middle grade, and I will always write middle grade. And the novel that's out this year is The Way Past Winter, and it's coming out with Chronicle Books. This is the proof cover, and it's been published so beautifully by Chronicle, and I absolutely adore it. But I am also writing another adult book at the moment. Like, I've done my first draft, and I just see my career as kind of this rolling basis of 1 year middle grade, 1 year adult. And I just hope that my readers trust me and trust me enough to follow me, and see that as a good thing rather than a kind of dilution of what I do.
So then what would you say when you think about your two hats of middle grade and adult now? What was this is such a big question, but what are the tools as a writer that you're using to write adult fiction that might be different from the tools you're writing middle grade, or vice versa? We're talking a lot this weekend about genre and category. And I think one thing I'm learning is just that we're all like able to move between them, and we just have to be our true selves as writers and be true to the story. But what would you say are the differences for you as a writer?
For me, it boiled down to character. I feel like when I'm writing a middle grade character, the way that you get to know a middle grade character is they show you through action who they are. So they make either a right or wrong decision, or a selfish or a selfless decision. And that's how you see them progress through the narrative, as they're doing stuff, they're making these decisions. And what I really loved about writing the Mercies was that I was able to just sit with a character, and it was like you could just point, instead of the camera doing all these like jump shots and being like, now they're over here, now they're doing this, you could really just sit with a character in a room and you could just be in their head and just, you know, notice the really subtle things, like the way they pull down their sleeve because they're nervous, or the way they touch someone on the wrist because they love them. You know, you could just really luxuriate in those smaller gestures, smaller moments, and spend a lot more time there. Like, I have never written a middle grade book where a whole chapter took place in one room with two characters having a conversation. Something's happening, you know, even if that is the case, they're doing something else. Whereas in the Mercies, there are chapters where there are just two characters being and noticing. And I think it allowed me to stretch muscles that I hadn't used before in that respect. But it certainly wasn't more difficult or easier than middle grade. It was just a very different discipline. And I think they're feeding each other. You know, writing adult is making me a better middle grade writer. Writing middle grade has certainly made me a better writer for adults. So I see it as a really symbiotic relationship where they're feeding each other.
Who are you as a reader? Do you read a lot of middle grade? Do you read a lot of adult? I imagine you're reading, you appear to be an extremely smart person. So I'm guessing you are reading a lot. But yeah, where does your heart lie when it comes to reading?
I read everything. I am a complete non-snob in terms of genre, anything. I read everything. I suppose I have soft spots for eventually what I've turned out to write, which is no great surprise. I love adventure stories for middle grade. Some of my favorites are things like The Northern Lights by Philip Pullman. And we've got a great writer here called Mallory Blackman, who writes sort of alternate universe fiction. And then in terms of novels for adults, I do have a real soft spot for historical fiction, really beautiful historical fiction like Fingersmith by Sarah Waters or Burial Rites by Hannah Kent, Margaret Atwood alias Grace, you know, those kind of approaches. And I recently read The Book of Night Women by Marlon James, and it like my mind completely, and I've got a book hangover actually from it. So I have a soft spot for certain types, but I will literally read everything. I've been reading loads of thrillers at the moment. I love a bit of true crime. You know, I read non-fiction memoir In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado recently.
Yeah.
Was extraordinary to me. So yeah, why deny yourself any delight? You know, I really do like to read widely.
And can we talk about you as a poet for a minute?
Sure.
Because I am a big fangirl of poetry, and I just would love to hear a little bit about how you came to poetry and where that fits now in your life as a writer.
So I have always been brought up on poetry. My dad in particular, he actually wanted to be a poet, but he was the son of a Yorkshire miner, so that wasn't really done. But he loved sort of the classic British poets like Auden, Ted Hughes, and T.S. Eliot, and would bring us up, you know, poetry. We weren't like having poetry readings around the dinner table, but you know, we would have poetry in our lives. I had a certain exposure to poetry, but not contemporary poetry until I met my husband, who's my boyfriend, and he bought me the entirety of a shortlist for a prize called the T.S. Eliot Prize, which is awarded to the best contemporary poetry collection, and it has winners like Ocean Vuong and Anne Carson, and, you know, a really wide church, broad church. And I just read these collections, and I just was, my mind was again just blown open. I realized poetry wasn't something in the past, it was something that's happening now and had real and urgent things to say about where we are now. And I find it so amazing how we turn to poetry in the most important times of our lives, at weddings, at funerals, but we forget about it in day-to-day life, when actually it's so good on the day-to-day. It's so good on noticing what's going on around us and giving us the right words to express it. And I basically just wanted a slice of that. I really wanted to get in on that. And I started writing after that. So I was about 21. I started writing. and it's so bad, you know, so bad to begin with. And then I was just learning and developing all the time, and started sending out to magazines, started getting published. Once I'd had enough publications, collected it into a collection that got published. And I had 3 collections published before my first novel, The Girl of Ink and Stars, came out. So that's my journey as a poet. And I have a project that I've had in mind since I was, you know, since 5 years ago, that I really want to write one day. But poetry isn't something I can slip in and out of the way I can when I'm writing middle grade or adult or YA. I can't go from prose into my poetry head. So I'm waiting for a breath, for a time when I can properly, you know, drill down and get better, because I do think writing is a muscle, and the more you use it, the stronger it becomes. And poetry is a specific muscle that I use sometimes in my prose. It certainly informs my prose. I love using, you know, I always think about how something sounds out loud, for example. That's a lesson that poetry's taught me. But it is just a different thing to write poetry. And, you know, I am nervous about trying out. I think it's like going for a run for the first time after you've not been for a few years. You know, you're just like, it's just going to be painful, but eventually you build up that strength again. And I have no doubt that I will come back to it, but I certainly don't think of myself as an active poet at the moment, because I think writing is a doing word. And, you know, if people are writing, they're writers. And that's, sorry, my cat is like just stalking around, meowing at me. She's like,
I love it. Luna, everybody remembers your cat's name is Luna. I also love that somebody in the chat said, hearing her say she was bad when she started writing gives me hope.
Yeah, so bad. I found some of my poetry recently, like one of the first poems I ever wrote, and my brother just my younger brother had a field day. He like read it aloud to the family as like a dramatic reading. It was so bad, but it got better. You know, you keep going.
So, and I'm wondering, we're having a panel discussion after this that's going to be about the writer's toolbox and the idea of those tools that writers have. And I'm just, you know, thinking about all the writers who are listening in right now as you talk, and also just being such a fan myself of your work. What are some of the tools that you would say you find yourself relying on again and again in that toolbox? You just alluded to the idea that you want your fiction to be, you want to think about how that sounds read aloud, that poetry taught you that. Are there other things you can share with us that might be inspiring to our folks today?
Absolutely. I think a huge issue that I see in aspiring writers is confidence. And I know that sounds like a kind of hippy dippy, like, oh, you've got to be confident, believe in yourself. But it's so true, because I think if you have conviction in yourself as a writer, that is the first step towards other people having that in you as a writer. I really think you've got to believe in yourself and love what you're writing. I think passion is an important thing. That said, there are literally daily craft-based things that you can be doing, like writing every day, like reading, like starting notebooks. I have notebooks for each different project, and I'll just like scribble down ideas and things. And that's not something that comes naturally to me, but it's certainly something that's helpful. I think finding your people is another really important thing. Finding people who take you seriously when you call yourself a writer, because I know how it is. You know, I was the first writer in my family. Luckily, I did have a lot of support, but, you know, find the people who won't roll their eyes when you're like, oh, I'm working on a novel. And, you know, find people you can talk to seriously about your book, because that also makes it more real. But unfortunately, no amount of talking about your book is going to make it happen. The only thing that will make a book happen is you sitting down and writing it. So I think sorry.
That's okay.
She's like, yeah, this is good advice. I think the key to writing is writing a first draft. And so many people just give up. And so set yourself a manageable word count and do not look back. Like, I never ever look and read over like I did for the Mercies, because we had such a short amount of time before we were submitting it. But normally I will just write from beginning to end, and I will not stop, and I will not look back, because there is nothing that cannot be fixed by the next draft. And I think one thing that I really also hate is watching that word count inch up. So I will literally cheat my document. I will copy and paste whatever I have 1,000 times if I need to, so that I have the word count for a novel. And then I'm just not watching that word count tick up. It's like just it really works for me, like to know that.
Back that up. So I want to do this, but I just want to make sure I understand. So you say you were me and you've started rewriting into a new document, and that document now has 10,000 words. What you're saying to me is you would copy and paste those 10,000 words up to like 80,000 words or whatever number, and then you would just be able to ignore that word count.
Yeah.
Love it.
Okay. Yeah. Because the blank page, like, who isn't terrified by the blank page?
Mm-hmm.
Every writer, you know, I'm on my 9th book now, and it does not get less scary. I am still faking it till I make it, but all I can control is getting the words down paper and then editing it until it's any good. You know, it's literally, I think that's what's so hard about writing, is there isn't a cheat. You know, you can do like little cheats like I've just described, but there is nothing that can do it for you but you. And I think that that's why believing in yourself is so important, because you are your own worst enemy when you're writing. You know, that voice in your head saying, this is terrible, oh my god, that is so cringe, how could you even have put that down, that's an insult to paper. You know, that I still have those voices every book I write. I've just got really good at putting them in a box until the end of that first draft, and just like throwing away the key, because the only way is through, unfortunately, when you're writing.
Oh my gosh. I want to ask you 2 last questions. I know you have been so wonderful, because I know you have some stuff going on. So
distraction.
What?
Distraction.
So I have the Mercies here because no one's getting me to let go of this book, but somebody asked, your book covers are magical. Are they all created by the same graphic artist? Can you talk about your involvement as a writer in the book jackets? And if you want to give a shout out to anyone in particular, you're welcome to.
So this is absolutely stunning, but I think Kirby won't be mad at me to say that it was a journey. It was a journey to arrive at this cover. And I am so lucky that Little Brown and the design team and my editor at Little Brown was so receptive to me just rejecting so many of their ideas, because, you know, I do believe that publishers know what they're doing, and part of being a published author is that you're in a collaboration. It's not just you anymore, and you have to trust your editor, you have to trust your publisher, you trust your agent, but also trust yourself. And every time I saw one of the covers, until I saw this cover, I was just like, no, that's not my book, that's not what this book is, it's not right. And I was just really lucky that they were very receptive. Some authors don't get a chance. I'm really embarrassed that this doesn't actually have the designer's name on it, because it's a proof. It's probably on your finished.
Oh yeah, I thought I have it.
But I don't, because in the UK I have the same designer for all my covers, who's a woman called Helen Crawford White, and she has done all my children's book covers.
This is jacket designed by Lucy Kim. I'm assuming no relation.
Yes, no relation.
And then some actually Getty images, like stock images for the images, but just beautifully done.
Like this is one of my YA covers, which I just adore, and then this is the UK cover for the Mercies, so a very different,
but still beautiful.
Still really beautiful. Yeah. And I actually personally prefer the US cover, just because I really love, for example, like just really strong singular images, and like Cersei had, you know, for example, or burial rites here in the UK had like a feather, and it was just, but this is so beautiful. And the more I've looked at it, the more I've fallen in love. But it is so interesting. A lot of my European publishers have gone for photographs, like doctor photographs, lots of women looking at the sea, and things like that. And I've also really loved those. Have I got my? I'm just seeing. No, I don't have my German cover. I thought I had it on my desk, but we're moving soon, so I packed a lot of stuff away. So
a lot going on, lady.
I know.
Let me ask you, because a couple people wanted to catch the name of the researcher that you mentioned on witches. Can you tell us that name again?
Her name is Dr. Liv, L-I-V, Helen, H-E-L-E-N-E, Williamson, W-I-L-L-U-M-S-E-N, Dr. Liv Helen Williamson. And she's at the University of Tromsø, and she is just one of my favorite humans. She's extraordinary. She's really extraordinary.
So assuming that he's still listening, do you think it'd be okay if we brought Kirby Kim visually to the table? We'll see. He was going to feed his children, as every good father should be doing, making lunch for the kiddos. Kirby, you out there?
Calling Kirby.
I'm going to invite him to start his video, and we'll see if he's around. There's that handsome mug.
Nice to see you.
Good to see you, Kiran.
We're in New York together.
We know it's been a while. It was so good to hang out when we were there, and I almost feel like it was the last time really that people could hang out, and make a trip like that.
Kirby,
Sure,
you're rocking.
Great.
I know he's rocking the pandemic hair. He's got a little facial action going on there. He's got his bookshelf behind him.
Yep. It's all. I'm falling apart. I gotta be honest. I really got to trim stuff. I was scrubbing toilets earlier. I was doing the weekend tasks. Is what it was. Yeah.
I want to say that to his credit, and that's why I kind of wanted him to hop on too, is that, there was a moment where I reached out to Kirby and I said, listen, we might need a little extra filler for our session. Would you want to drop everything, including that toilet brush, and on the session? And of course he said yes, because Kirby's amazing, and he's a really amazing agent. So I thought I would just, if you guys don't mind, for just a couple minutes, I know I don't want to keep you, Kiran, longer than we possibly can, but could you just, I don't know, talk about, and this is probably an interesting agent client relationship too, because there is another agent involved in the UK side of things, right? So
yeah, we can forget about her.
Okay, good.
It's about this bond.
She's probably still cleaning her toilet, right? So what's the meet cute for you two? How did this happen?
We are going to have to talk about Helly then.
Yeah, then we are going to have to give her all the credit, actually, in a way. Yeah, Helly was, when she first encountered the cartographer's daughter at the time, I think that's what it was called originally, right? And what we went with in the US, she called me up and was just, we had become fairly new colleagues at Janklow, at Janklow. And, we often, between the UK and the US office, we share clients, and we have our UK counterparts represent the UK rights on books and vice versa. And so she was so excited about the book, but I also knew she was in one hell of a beauty contest. And I never got the full story, but the way Helly made it sound, it was like, beyond Thunderdome. And there were like all these agents that were going for it. And so I was just, I read it and I was like, I know I can sell it here. And I just kind of supported her. And, if I'm remembering correctly at that point, it was like she could go back and say, okay, there's US representation and whatnot. And, we're going to do this in a big way. And so that was how it did. And when we went out, actually, Helly had the great idea even to wrap the manuscript boxes in like map gift paper with like twine. And we just kind of went all out for this one because it was so gorgeous and it had such a kind of tactile element to the story. And really, I do have to give so much, really all the credit to Helly.
Like you
but
to go with Janklow though, like, American, I thought that was incredible that then, that it was this huge, because Janklow is so huge in the US, it's like the agency, and and then in the UK you've got this more boutique, sort of smaller, and so you've got the best of both worlds. You've got this sort of powerhouse and the behind it, but also this really individual attention, and you don't feel like just another client. You feel like you've got this individual relationship, not only with Kirby, not only with Helly, but with Helly and Kirby. The three of us are so often in conversation at the same time, and it feels like a proper three-way relationship in that respect, which is, I think, incredibly lucky and quite unusual, actually.
Can I ask you, Kiran, because I hope that there are many writers listening right now who find themselves in the position of having multiple agents offering them representation. And I guess you having gone through that and now looking back, what would be the advice you would give to a writer who's in that moment? What are the questions that you either did ask that you're so glad you asked, or the ones that you thought, I should have asked that question, that can help them sort of think about that conversation?
I think it's so hard to remember when you're at that stage, is that you do have some of the power, and I don't mean that in a kind of megalomania, like I have the power, but this is a two-way relationship. They're buying into you as much as you're buying into them. Like there has to be that mutual trust and respect, and really there was just this click with Helly, and my instinct as soon as I had that initial meeting was, this is it, this is my person, and this is who I want fighting for me and my stories in this incredibly competitive world. And it's the same thing with Kirby. Like, I couldn't think of a better champion for my books. Like, I'm not a good enough, compared to them, like I'm not a good enough champion for my books. Like they just believe in me in a way that I don't even. And so I do think that instinct is really important, because what then happened was I did get seduced by going to other meetings and people sort of blowing smoke up my ass, and
which feels great.
Fine. But really it is about that connection and that relationship, and that you can have a frank conversation with someone and trust that you can say stuff that might be stupid, and trust when they tell you you're being stupid, or that that's not the right idea, or there's this real mutual trust that's going on that I don't think I share with anyone on that level apart from my husband. Like it really is that intense of and that important of a relationship to me, what I have with Kirby and Helly. And I think, and actually talking to some of my friends, they don't have that with their agents. Sometimes some of my friends are with agents, they're scared to ask a question, and that just shouldn't, I don't think that should ever be the case. And it's obviously, everyone's an individual, it's whatever works for you and your writing, and everyone has different priorities. But for me, I wanted this to be a lifelong partnership. I wanted to be able to trust their judgment, and so that click, that gelling was so important.
Yeah, wow. And Kirby, how about you in terms of just when you think about clients and you think about what Kiran does to not only, I think, fight for herself and support herself, but also how she's a partner. What are the sorts of things that you look for in a client that make them a good partner to an agent?
I think one of the things that makes this really work so well, when it's going great and when it's also not going great, is that we are pretty candid with each other, and we're all pretty aware of like the aim and getting there. all together, you know, our interests are very much aligned, and I can just be like, you know, I don't know what's going on over there. You know, I'm going to give you what they're telling me, but here's what I'm thinking. And also if there's a question about, you know, for instance, you know, the cover conversations, we had a lot of conversations about the cover for the Mercies before we would then figure out how to message that to Little Brown, right? And to just figure out, look, we're all on the same page here, and we all have the same aim, and understanding how to communicate so that we get the best response, right? And I think that has always been something that for this relationship has worked really well, because I think some writers also want the agent who just comes in there and wields a kind of hammered fist and tries to kick down the door, and that's the style they want. And that's not really how either Helly or I communicate or interact with the people we do business with. And I don't think that's what Kiran wants in her representatives either. And so that all aligns pretty well. And I think that's one of the things that makes it, it's one small example of just a larger kind of relationship philosophy and how we interact with the people we're doing business with.
Yeah. So I just want to say that when this pandemic is over, when you've had your beautiful child and you are back to receiving, having sleep and getting to travel, that the Writers League of Texas is bringing you here to do an event in person, to talk to us, to just hang out, whatever you want to do. And we're going to bring Kirby too. I think it's been so special to have you both pop in like this. Kirby, thank you for doing that. But you know, Kiran, the sun has literally set since you put on.
Now I'm just illuminating my laptop.
Since you have come on, we have taken up a lot of your time, and thank you so much. So I just want to say a big thank you to you folks, a big thank you to everyone who came for the session to hang out. Book People has the link. You have the link in your program. They have the Mercies. I don't think they're going to have any copies left in about an hour, because I have a feeling they are all about to be swooped up. But also the kids' books, I think, are really something for you guys to look for too.
Yes, pre-orders.
Pre-orders.
Gorgeous.
Way past winter. But mostly, Kiran, thank you so much. I'm a huge fan, and I really appreciate you doing this, and I appreciate you, Kirby, just helping make this happen. So